Well, good evening, everybody, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I think we found a time that may not be convenient for everybody, but it seems to be possible for everybody. I'm delighted to have you here. I apologize for the delay in starting. We've been having technical difficulties. In fact, we're still having some technical difficulties. But we have all parties here, if not in video, at least in audio. So we're ready to get started, and I appreciate everybody's patience in sticking with us. And I have no idea what that noise was, but in any event, I'm really happy to do this. It's a real honor for CSIS to present the work that Kati Swamin and Next Trade Group have done, looking at the implementation of the e-commerce chapter of CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, an agreement that those of us at CSIS, I believe unanimously, all hope the United States will someday join, but we are not there quite yet, but I continue to have hope. But this is an important report, I think, because it's the first one that I've seen that looks at how this agreement is being implemented. In this particular case, we're looking specifically at the e-commerce chapter, which I think is probably the one of the primary ones. But this is based on surveys and other data that NextTrade has developed, and Kati will explain a little bit about her methodology when she presents the paper. But she did an earlier paper, which we'll talk about during the panel, that looked at some expectations about what was going to happen. And now that we're not everybody has implemented, but I think we've got 7 or 8 have implemented. So we're well into the agreement, and now we can begin to draw some conclusions about how it's working. And the first set of conclusions deal specifically with e-commerce, which couldn't be more timely given the enormous growth of the use of digital transactions and digital technologies in e-commerce, which was well underway before COVID, but the pandemic, if nothing else, really stimulated that because there weren't a lot of in-person alternatives at the time. So I think this is going to be a significant event, and the data that she's gathered in her report I think will be important for all of you that are listening. The report, by the way, was released today by CSIS. It is now on our website. So go to www.csis.org and you should be able to see it, I hope, right up front. If you can't, go to the Scholl chair, SCHOLL chair, and see if you can find it there. So what we're going to do tonight is Kati's going to present the paper. I'm saying tonight because I'm here, but she's going to present the paper. And then after that, we have a panel of distinguished experts from the United States, Japan, and Australia, who are going to then comment on it and talk about it for a while. And then we will have time at the end for questions from the audience. I'm going to introduce the panel after Kati's remarks. So right now, let me start with our star attraction, which is the author and presenter of the paper. Kati Swamin is an adjunct fellow with CSIS, which is one of the reasons why we're doing this. And she focuses especially on digitization, disruptive technologies, and trade issues. She's the founder and CEO of Los Angeles-based Next Trade Group, which helps governments, multilateral development banks, and Fortune 500 technology companies enable trade through technology. She also serves as adjunct professor at the UCLA Anderson School of Management. She's a prolific author, over 100 papers and 10 peer-reviewed books. Most recently, one titled Revolutionizing World Trade, How Disruptive Technologies Open Opportunities for All. So a distinguished background and a lot of very useful research. You should be able to see Kati's first slide, and I'll turn it over here now for the presentation. Go ahead, Kati.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Bill, and thanks to the panelists for being here and also for the audience, and apologies for the slight delay. Came to discover a very useful way to get into Zoom is through the web browser, and I've never had a problem, but this time had, and thank you for waiting on me. So we did this study on monitoring digital trade agreements, and those of us in the panel and in the audience, there's probably many champions of trade and trade agreements, and all of us have been one way or the other involved in commenting that implementing trade agreements is, of course, what really makes them work, that it's absolutely critical to implement them. And 15, 20 years ago, we looked at the implementation of trade agreements and market access provisions in particular, and others, regional development banks have looked at RTAs, how they are implemented, what their benefits are. The WTO has their Committee on Regional Trade Agreements that also monitors, assesses trade agreements, reviews them. And then, of course, there's a trade policy review process. So there's a number of instances that have looked at how countries are implementing trade agreements, what the impact of those agreements are, and of course, a voluminous literature on regional trade agreements. So what we wanted to do here is, Japet, if you go back one slide, is to the next one. So, bit by bit, there's been an increase in the trade agreements that contain digital trade chapters, or, sometimes revised trade agreements like the USMCA, included kind of in the NAFTA framework, a digital trade chapter. And then there are freestanding trade agreements. So if you go to the next slide, there's a number of trade agreements now, and standalone digital trade agreements that encompass a number of provisions, the CPTPP being perhaps the leader and that started the way. And when we look at the insides of these agreements, the texts are very similar on the core provisions, such as the moratorium on customs duties, ban on data localization, and localization of computing facilities, and free cross-border movement of data, as well as the non-discriminatory treatment of digital products. A number of provisions of that nature. And then as agreements have proliferated, there are more and more provisions that are not necessarily binding, but are still about how countries can interoperate and work together in the digital era. And just a sample here at the bottom, there's many more in the study that we prepared. So this is a big deal for countries, and for us, we thought it's a big deal now to start to monitor the implementation of these provisions, given that these are really critical for the future of digital trade. So we go to the next slide. We did a study, maybe tap one more. We did a study last year with CSIS, and that's available on the website with Bill, looking at what the impact of CPTPP is so far. And what we discovered, asking companies and SMEs about the different provisions in the CPTPP, how they like them so far, what have these provisions done for them. There are a great deal of benefits that companies in the CPTPP region cited from these various provisions. And we also established through some econometrics that this digital trade chapter, if you want, has further benefits than just having an agreement that covers trading goods, services, and investment provisions. So there's kind of extra value for trade from having digital trade chapters, and companies seem to attest to that as well. And if you look at the next slide, we have yet in the agreement when we asked companies, well, what would you like out of this agreement? They said, well, number one, we want this agreement to be better enforced, so that there's a sense that the agreement's implementation is still wanting and could be better enforced. And of course, there's a wish list of other provisions that could be then attached to this agreement, provided that countries actually enforce their commitments. So this is a big deal for companies. They love the agreement, but they want better enforcement. And that's something that we wanted to pilot and see how we might want to do that enforcement and monitoring the implementation of the agreement. So if we go to the next slide, what we basically did here is, in light of the fact that the CPTPP recently put in place something called the Ecommerce Committee, whose job is basically to look at how the agreement and the digital e-commerce chapter is being implemented, we wanted to kind of help the e-commerce committee with this study and say, well, here is a potential methodology on how you can actually implement, monitor the implementation of the agreement, covering the e-commerce chapter in this case, and creating kind of a prototype product, a scoring system that perhaps the e-commerce committee can use or perhaps modify a little bit, but at least there's a kind of test here, a pilot way to score based on different laws and policies, regulations that the countries have assumed and have in place. and then industry association views as well, kind of ground truthing. What does business community think about the implementation so far, as well as surveys with the further set of SMEs. And then here we're also proposing a process that the e-commerce committee could use annually, for example, to monitor the implementation. And of course, this can be then extended to other areas that are pertinent to digital trade, like trading services or IP chapters, telecom chapters, and so forth. So ours is a relatively humble kind of initial effort to see how we could better monitor the implementation. So if you go to the next slide, the methodology we used was basically take 14 of the, I believe, 18 key provisions in the digital chapter or e-commerce chapter, and establish a number of ways to analyze to the extent to which they meet CPTPP rules. We used a number of sources. So we used national laws in some cases where the CPTPP calls for the countries to look at or put in place a certain law. In other cases, we used kind of business surveys where it was harder just to back into a law, or where the provision was written in such a way that it didn't require a country to put in place a law. And then we used some self-reported data, for instance, on paperless trade provisions. And so if you click on it a couple of times, we actually established this kind of a traffic light system to assess countries' implementation. And there's a scoring method at the end of the report that we used. This is a challenging exercise to fit the diversity of different kinds of laws and regulations, policies, implementation kind of patterns into these three different buckets. But that's what we did for the sake of simplicity. There's a lot of kind of gray areas, if you want, as well, if one goes deeper. So next. And so here are the initial results. By and large, we see that in many areas like online consumer protection laws, electronic transactions framework, where the countries have assumed those, where the countries have complied with the ban on customs duties on electronic transmissions, it seems everybody is doing okay based on the laws. However, we discovered, basically on the business survey, quite a lot of kind of discriminatory treatment or not exactly fair treatment in the market access of digital products. And then there was also insufficient implementation, in our view, in the paperless trade provisions. And then cybersecurity is also something that's one thing. And then there are a couple of challenges. If you proceed one more time, is a couple of countries where we found kind of challenging areas in Vietnam and Brunei in particular, where it seems that there is kind of lack of implementation or in compliance, if you want, based on this simple scoring system. And Vietnam's case, particularly the new implementing rules, the decree 53 that is about implementing the cybersecurity law, of course, contains kind of data localization provisions and also requires companies to store data in Vietnam. So that raises concern. And then in Brunei's case, I think there was a regulation not in place to prevent spam. That's something that the CPTPP calls for. So that's our initial rather conservative way of assessing countries. And if you go to the next slide, what we did was create kind of a traffic light system for the entire agreement, where we can look at these compliance country by country, provision by provision, and keep assessing compliance this way. If we go to the next slide, we also did some kind of ground truthing with businesses. So this was done in two ways. One was that we looked at a standardized set of business associations, big industry associations that operate in the CPTPP region or have opined on those countries' regulations, and looked at kind of expressions of concern, almost like adverse media reporting, and looked at what large companies in particular that lead these associations are concerned about. And then we asked also SMEs about, how good do you think the implementation has been? So here are some reports kind of from ground up. And I think this is very useful because a country may have a great law in place, but perhaps that law is not implemented very well. So looking at what business community actually says is vital, I think, to these monitoring exercises. Next. And so this is some further business views, how SMEs view the completeness of implementation as a whole of the chapter. We asked a lot of questions, we have a lot of data on SMEs views, and Japan, Australia, Canada, Singapore, New Zealand do quite well. And then we have those countries that like Vietnam and Brunei that have room for improvement. And we also asked things like, well, how likely are you to invest in the CPTPP market in question in light of its CPTPP implementation? And as you can see, there's kind of a positive correlation between SMEs that find a country implementing the agreement well and the likelihood of actually investing in the market. So then on the process, well, if the CPTPP e-commerce committee likes this kind of approach, and seeks to adopt something similar, it could also then have a process in place. And one step of the process is this analytical part, where we look at different laws, we look at different association and think tank views, reports, surveys with firms, dialogues with industry associations, and do this initial scoring. And then if you go a step beyond, there could be a peer review. Just as at the WTO, we have the TPR, the Trade Policy Review. That's a peer review, essentially. There could be a similar process in the CPTPP, and then kind of a final scoring based on that and members' commitment, hopefully, to remedy a lack of implementation. And then the further step could be kind of ongoing kind of digital trade dialogues with businesses as well to kind of see from the users of the agreement, how is it going, and sharing of best practices. I think a lot of countries in this region, in particular, CPTPP region, have come up with all kinds of positive digital policies, all kinds of new innovations in their subsequent agreements that could also be, this could also be like a learning mechanism for countries to think about the future of trade regulations. So if you tap on it one more time, I think just to conclude, I think, to remain a kind of gold standard trade agreement, the CPTPP really needs a gold standard monitoring process. It's very important for the agreement now that there's more and more countries such as the UK, such as Costa Rica, such as Ecuador, Taiwan, or China wanting to get in, that the current members set the bar high and ensure that the applicants then are clear on the bar that they are held against. And also this process is, I think, helpful to ensure that countries kind of don't just sign up to any old rule that comes their way. And as countries are thinking about taking the CPTPP to the next level, could there be a monitoring exercise in place that makes countries to really consider, do I want to go and take this new obligation on? Am I ready to implement that? It would instill this kind of sense of seriousness into the system. And then, of course, we can extend this to other trade agreements, other chapters, as well as the applicants themselves, and assess their level of readiness, if you want, for this world-class trade agreement. So thanks very much. That's all my side, and look forward to the panel.
Well, excellent. That's a lot of information, a lot of slides, but they are all in either the paper that was released today, or at least in one case, the paper that was released last year, both of which are available on our website. So I urge all of you that are listening to click on the website and download the papers, and you can review the data in greater detail. Let me now introduce the panel, and Kadi's going to remain on the panel as well. We'll have a discussion. Then, as I said, I think there's a way for you, those of you listening, to click on something and submit questions, and we'll, if there are any of those, we'll get to those later in the event. We have three panelists, three distinguished panelists with us. Sujiro Arata has a huge number of jobs. He's professor emeritus at Waseda University. He's also senior research advisor at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, faculty fellow at the Research Institute of Economy, Trade and Industry, visiting fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute, specially appointed fellow at the Japanese Center for Economic Research, and distinguished senior fellow at the Institute of Developing Economics. That's a lot of roles. I suspect you're very busy, and thank you so much for giving us your time today. Second panelist is Elizabeth Bowes, who is the chief negotiator for Regional Trade Agreements Division at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. That makes her the IPREF person as well, does it not? The Indo-Pacific Economic, not the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but it makes her the CPTPP person, which is why he's with us. Prior to going back to Canberra to take on these assignments, Elizabeth was based here in Washington at the Australian Embassy, which is how I got to know her, and was sorry when she left, but she's moved on to obviously bigger and better things, and I'm delighted to have her back. I see that I didn't know this, but I see that before you were at the embassy, you were the head of the Tobacco Plain Packaging Task Force for your government. I was on the other side of that issue. I would love to have a conversation with you about that and explain in some detail why your government was wrong, but we won't do that. We won't do that today. We'll save that for another occasion. And finally, Jonathan McHale is currently, as of this year, the Vice President for Digital Trade at the Computer and Communications Industry Association, CCIA, which I think is an association that many of you have heard of since it operates all over the world. And there he leads the association Digital Trade Advocacy in the United States and elsewhere. Until this year, he was the Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Information Communication Technology Services and Digital Trade. And he has 2 decades of experience working to open foreign markets in the telecommunications and digital trade sectors at both the Department of State and in USTR. So we have a wealth of experience from both Asia and the United States that we can tap into for the conversation. Before I ask the panelist question, though, I want to go back to Kadi on a couple things to flesh out a little bit about what you said. For our listeners that are newbies and are not experts, because we usually have some, can you define what you're talking about when you say digital trade and provide a little bit more detail about what that means? Is it simply the cross-border transfer of data, or are there other aspects that you looked at in your compilation of data?
Well, I guess you can think of it in broader or narrow ways. If you think of it more kind of narrow ways, it can involve the movement of data and certainly of kind of digital services, as well as content and digital products. Or, you can think of ebooks and things of that nature, games, what have you, and a number of technologies even embedded in some actual physical products. And then you can think of it as e-commerce in goods, if you take a broader interpretation, certainly. And of course, the broader you go, the more, I guess, other chapters of the CPTPP kick in as well, like market access for goods. So, it depends a little bit how broadly or narrowly we end up considering digital trade.
Now, in your 2021 report, you looked at and how the CPTPP e-commerce provisions had facilitated trade in goods, digital goods and services among the members. We're now a year after you did that report. Have you looked at that again? Has anything changed? Have the economies continued to be more integrated in digital trade, or have you not looked at that?
Yeah, I guess, one could say just the explosion of e-commerce and digital transactions, whether it's in goods and services after COVID, suggests that there's more and more activity, including across borders. And certainly you see these countries' kind of retail sectors are more about e-commerce, more about digital transactions. Certainly cross-border, the data is sparser, but there seems to be a great deal of activity. Small businesses in particular getting into e-commerce and selling digital services, selling content, kind of creators emerging around the world. So certainly, I would expect that if we had perfect data, we would see a great increase, and certainly in this region, which is a very dynamic region for e-commerce. So we could certainly take another look at what goes on, and with the surveys that we did here, it suggests that SMEs are just increasing and businesses are just increasing their transactions across borders.
Well, let me turn to the panel now and ask a first question for all of you, which is just let's start with a kind of a general comment about both the paper and about how your perception of how the e-commerce chapter is being implemented from the point of view of Japan and Australia in particular, but from Jonathan's point of view from the sort of the U.S. point of view about how this is implemented. Both is, what do you see happening? And do you think what Kadi's done is an accurate reflection of your sense of what's going on? Shujiro, you want to go first?
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. And my first impression of the paper or the study is an excellent, I think, contribution to the issue of digital trade, particularly in CPTPP. I have a couple of questions. This is based on survey, right? And when you say implementation of CPTPP provisions on e-commerce, when a firm says, there are some problems, and does that mean that the implementation is not done? In my view, there are like two steps. Implementation will be done by the government. When I ask the Japanese government if you have implemented it, X and Y and Z, and they said, oh, we did because we didn't have to really change any legal, framework. We were there. I mean, there's no problem. So it's being implemented. But the problem faced by SMEs or companies is this not implementation, but maybe enforcement in your view, or I guess compliance. So I think there are two issues here. When you say implementation of CPTPP, it'll be done by the government. But maybe, and there are maybe some problems with the government that they didn't implement. But when SMEs see the problem, it's possible because of the lack of implementation or lack of compliance, lack of enforcement. And in my view, the survey finds about this compliance issues rather than implementation. So I just want to make sure that I understand the how to interpret the results of survey. And talking about survey, you only did the survey 1,100 SMEs. I'm just curious to know the characteristics of these surveyed firms. Are they all US firms, firms from different countries? Are you going to do a similar survey on large firms? Because, large firms and SMEs tend to have different, maybe, problem difficulties. So these are, I guess, some of the points I wanted to raise at this time. But again, I think this is a very important study. This is the one way really to maybe enforce the agreements, and I really congratulate you on doing this kind of study. Thank you very much.
Kadi, do you want to respond to the questions? Then we'll go to Elizabeth.
Yeah, just thank you very much, Dr. Urata. It is very helpful. I think, something that we want to really clarify is that the assessment, the kind of traffic light system, we really based mostly on just looking at countries' laws and have they put in place or maintained a law that the CPTPP requires them to have. So we didn't base the actual scoring on business surveys except for one provision, which is the digital non-discrimination on digital products, because how it's worded, it's basically it's most conducive to looking at it not through is there a law or not in place or some sort of regulation, but what businesses feel. So we really just used the survey and business sentiment kind of as a secondary information, kind of ground truthing a little bit what we see on. And as for the surveyed firms, we looked at companies that are operating in the CPTPP region. So it's from one of the member countries, it's always the company. And then we asked the companies, are you selling into or operating in Australia if you're not an Australian company from the CPTPP region? And if you are, then you are allowed to opine on how Australia is implementing. So it's really those kinds of companies that are operating in any one CPTPP market that were invited into the survey. But that was kind of secondary at this point to the actual scoring based on national laws and policies in place.
Thank you very much. Are you going to do this survey on large firms as well as SMEs?
Yeah, and we did, think about that. And these were actually quite large firms, rather kind of mid-sized firms, more so than micro and large. And then I think the business association views quite reflect the large technology companies' views. So that's how we thought of this going through this.
Fortunately,
thank you very much.
When we get to Jonathan, we can hear from representatives of some of the larger companies. Let's do Elizabeth first.
Thanks very much, Bill, and thanks so much for the invitation to participate today. It's great to see you again, albeit virtually after so long. No, thank you. This report is very helpful for CPTPP members as we approach 3 years of in-force operation of the agreement. Actually, it's more than 3 years, but with COVID, of course, impacting all of our businesses, it's particularly timely to have a review of business sentiment. So for us, the value of this report is not only a fairly thorough review from a government perspective of the laws and regulations that have been put in place, but it's also an important gauge of business views, particularly for business in the region. And I note Sugiro Urata's questions. We had similar questions in terms of which SMEs, which industries are represented in the survey. But necessarily, we do focus on SMEs. They are the backbone of our economy in Australia and indeed in many economies. And so having a snapshot of SME views is indeed very helpful. I would put in a note of caution, despite the utility of the report, noting that, of course, surveys necessarily have a subjective element. So we do have to be a little cautious about the extent to which we rely, and I note Kati's comment that it's necessarily a secondary scoring element that has been taken based on business views. But business views are subjective. And in this respect, as Sugiro Urata said, it's not always clear if they're complaining about implementation, compliance, enforcement, or indeed just a perception of difference in treatment if I look at the non-discriminatory elements. So it would be helpful to unpack business views a little bit more. And that's because ultimately it is up to each party to determine how they implement the obligations in the agreement. And I note there can be quite significant variations in implementation. Some countries will do the bare minimum. I think, Kati, you noted that some parties will say, well, we already have laws on the books, so we don't need to change anything. Whereas other parties will really go above and beyond implementation in looking at the commitments and reflecting them in their national laws. And there could be very good reasons for different approaches to implementation. So I say this from a governmental perspective as an overlay on what I think is a useful report, but necessarily a subjective snapshot of business sentiment in terms of implementation of CPTPP e-commerce commitments. Thanks.
Jonathan, US perspective, larger company perspective, maybe.
Thank you. Our association has the big companies, as you can expect, but also many smaller companies as well. So we do think the SME focus is quite important. First, a comment about US interest generally. We're not party to TPP, so I received a lot of pushback when I was back in USTR, focusing on whether a country was complying or not, because nobody wanted to have to answer, well, why don't you just join the agreement? And that would then you would have a seat at the table. One counter to that is that, notwithstanding the fact that the US government is not party to the agreement, our companies actually do benefit from the rules, and they have standing under the agreement to be treated no less favorably than an Australian company trying to do business in Vietnam, etc. So we do have a strong interest, apart from the fact that we helped negotiate these rules, and we did also carry them forward in other agreements. I think it's an excellent idea to have this implementation type scorecard. I also take the point that, yes, business sentiment and business perceptions don't necessarily match with a legal obligation. But I would say that it is really important to understand why the smaller companies feel that way. And even if it's not a question of you're out of compliance, if they have reasons for explaining why the agreement didn't do what one expected it to do, that is really important going forward to make these actually function better. In terms of the actual substance of the rules, I divide them into two buckets. One is the affirmative bucket and one is the negative bucket. The affirmative being you have to put a law in place. The negative, which frankly I think is actually more important, is a constraint on the government from doing bad things. So don't put in place a customs duty, don't discriminate, etc. In most of those cases, there's nothing for the government to do. So it's not like they need a law. So I would take issue, for example, on the data flow piece. There's no law that has to be put in place to allow the free flow of data. It's a rule to ask governments not to impede it. And the work is looking at what are those impediments and are they justified, etc. But I think as a general matter, it is critical to be able to have a perception that these agreements are actually monitored and enforced, and have a dialogue between the governments and the private sector on what the problem is and how it can be done better. I will say one last comment on I'm glad that Vietnam was a focus of this, as before we left TPP, we spent a lot of time actually doing something very much like this as a way of monitoring to make sure that they would come into compliance, because under US law, we actually have to certify before the agreement comes into effect that the country was in compliance. And I think that the report very well identified a couple of the areas where there still are a lot of ongoing issues on the cybersecurity law and on some other things that we can speak more about later if there's interest. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. It's always fun to talk about the laggards rather than the people that are doing the best. And it seemed to me that Kati mentioned that in her presentation. It was really people that seem to be the farthest behind were Vietnam, Brunei, and I think also Mexico, looking at the chart, seemed to be not quite as far along as some of the others. Japan and Australia, I think, were ahead of the game significantly. Let me ask Kati first and then ask the others if they agree with her. Number one, why? Is this just slow implementation, or is there resistance, do you think, in those countries? And second, looking at the chart, it seemed that the places where there was the most implementation was the relatively low-hanging fruit. But maybe you could say a word about which particular provisions seem to be the least implemented or the most problematic.
Yeah, thanks so much for the comments. And just to reiterate, we just use this business sentiment not as a centerpiece, but just as a sidebar almost, that we had giant Excels going, looking at countries' laws and policies that are in place. And in some cases, as Jonathan, you mentioned, like data transfer or localization of servers or computing facilities. We looked at these practices or laws, policies that impede, say, data transfer. So this was really based on what governments are doing, and then just, having as a sidebar what companies think about that. But of course, if one does a very rigorous and even bigger surveys with firms, firms' views can be surfaced, and certainly like these digital dialogues that governments can put in place to talk about the implementation, how's it going from the firm's perspective, could be very helpful in this. But really want to stress that the scoring method that we created was really about the laws and policies first and foremost that are in place. Bill, to your point, I think what we found was these kind of simpler things where countries already had compliance probably before the agreement, like electronic authentication. We found things on electronic signatures, consumer protection laws that are in place, things like that. Everybody scored well on those, and in many cases, those were already in place, perhaps years before the agreement. In some cases, of course, in Vietnam, the implementation would have been better had it not been for the Decree 53, which was kind of a bomb thrown in the middle of this work, and in August of this year was put in place, and that outlines these data localization and kind of server localization provisions for Vietnam. So that was a very good example of the kinds of things that countries may put in place and that may have detrimental impacts to the other members. Those were a couple of the challenging areas, and then there was, of course, incomplete implementation as we scored it on paperless trade provisions as well by countries, and those are again, typically self-reported by customs administrations of countries. So it's coming straight from the countries and how they have implemented, say, the TFA provisions as well.
Any comment from the panelists on what she said? Elizabeth.
Yes, thanks, Bill. And I absolutely agree that many of the rules did reflect members' existing settings, but of course the value is having them reflected as commitments in the agreement to provide certainty, transparency, and prevent any stepping back or derogation from those rules. But I would say that perhaps one of the big challenges that we saw in CPTPP and indeed other agreements with digital provisions is the different level of development of some of the parties. And that really then is reflected in relevant transition periods that might have been needed by some of the parties to implement the commitments, and also the extent to which parties can sign up to these commitments. Now, CPTPP, we did have a different level of development, but this is going to be a bigger challenge on IPREF, for example, Bill, even though I'm not negotiating it, but you have a very broad range of countries in IPREF. And so it will be a challenge to try and maintain that high level of digital rules and standards that are reflected in the CPTPP in an agreement as big as IPREF. If you want to look at a counterfactual, perhaps RCEP is an example where some of the commitment provisions in CPTPP are reflected as best endeavours. So we have to look at different levels of development for members, and then how we can support the uptake of the commitments by different members in an agreement. And this is where provisions such as capacity building and economic cooperation support will be so important to really embed the norms and standards that are reflected in the CPTPP rules. And that will also certainly be an element of IPREF. So we have to keep that in mind as well. Thanks, Bill.
Okay, thank you. Let me remind the audience that if you have a question, now is the time. There's a button underneath the live stream that says Ask Live Questions. Push on that, write your question in, and we will do our best to get to it. Let me ask Jonathan, this came up a couple of minutes ago, maybe you could elaborate a little bit. Protection of source code and enhancing cybersecurity are emerging as key areas for progress within CPTPP. What do you think the members need to do on source code protection and cybersecurity, and how do they make progress on that?
Thanks. So let me start with cybersecurity. It is a relatively soft obligation. It's a recognition plus a focus on some of the mechanisms that governments can use to collaborate. I think moving forward, the U.S. wants to make it a stronger discipline, but it's not like there was an established model on how you handle cybersecurity. So this is a typical new issue that governments were grappling with, knew that it was important, and wanted to put it into a trade agreement. There is a mechanism out there, the CERTs, the computer emergency response teams in almost every country, that do have these ongoing collaborative relationships around the world. And so it really is a question of deepening those. And in many cases, it is a capacity building issue. where a lot of other governments do need training on how to defend against malicious malware, etc. On the source code side, again, this is one of those, it's a negative rule. It says don't require the implementation of the source code. So it's not like governments have to do a lot in order to implement it. There is one issue that is relevant, however, and this has been a big issue with Korea, for example, which is in their regulatory regime. Sometimes for conformity assessment, for example, the government does want to have access to source code or wants someone to test the source code. And in Korea, they do not have a trade secrets law. And so the ability of the government to prevent a test lab, for example, that gets access to source code from then handing it out and not having any consequence, any legal consequence to that is a problem. So that's a separate issue. It's more an IPR issue, but that's often the constraint that governments use as a way to make sure that source code is adequately protected. I will say this was an idea that came from Japan. Japan introduced this into TPP, born of experience in, I think it was mainly the manufacturers trying to get products into China, and the Chinese government saying, well, in order for it to be safe, we want to see the source code. And I think there's been a good record of governments typically realizing that's not necessary and not having that as a regulatory requirement, although we do see it changing with AI and governments much more interested in looking at source code for those type of products. Thanks.
Comments from either from Suzhou or Elizabeth on that? Okay, let me turn then to the two of you, Suzhou and Elizabeth, and this is your opportunity to make news, I hope, but that's up to you. There's new applicants for CPTPP. The UK, China, Taiwan, Ecuador, Costa Rica have asked to join. We understand that there are other countries that are considering it as well, and there may be additional applications. I hope for the US, but that's a separate story. How have these applications been received by your governments, Japan and Australia in your cases, and how do you think that process is going to play out?
Okay, shall I
go ahead.
first? Thank you very much. I'm not in the government, so I think Elizabeth knows the current status of, UK's negotiation. What I hear is that the government, maybe Japanese government, is busy, very busy, dealing with this UK alone, because this is the first, case, and therefore they're not really, they cannot really deal with other countries yet. And some of my Chinese friends tell me that the Japanese government is not willing to discuss China's entry into CPTPP. That's what I hear from some of my Chinese friends. But I'm not sure if that is the case. There are, of course, two different views about the China's possible entry into CPTPP in Japan. One, of course, is in favor, and the other is not in favor. But as far as I'm concerned, I think we need to I think it is a very good opportunity to discuss some of the problems that the Chinese government or Chinese companies have, say, in the case of IPR protection. I mean, this is my comment, not specific on maybe digital trade, but maybe more on general. There are some problems with the performance of Chinese companies and Chinese government in various areas, so-called unfair trade practices. And I think this discussion or debates associated with the possible entrance of China to CPTPP gives us a very good opportunity to discuss these issues and to make sure if they know that in order to be admitted they have to satisfy all these conditions. And I think we have to be very strict about this. So I hope the discussion will start, and maybe that will go into maybe possible negotiation with China. And this is one way to really correct their unfair trade practices. So this has been discussed quite actively in Japan. That's why I brought this up. Taiwan issue is somewhat different. I don't think I hear much about the Taiwan issue or CPTPP yet, because China is a much more, I guess, difficult issue. Thank you.
Elizabeth?
Thanks, Bill. Well, as you know, CPTPP is an open platform, and the accession or the interest in accession to the agreement is something that we welcome. We do want to see the rules and standards established in the region. They will support rules-based trade, and they are very high standards. So we do see it as a model for trade in the region. Sujiro Urata is correct. We have and we are continuing to focus on the UK's accession application. It is the first that we're undergoing. So we're establishing the processes, the accession processes, as we establish and monitor or examine the UK's claims to accession. And that has actually taken more time than we expected, but we want to set a robust precedent for other accession applications that may be considered by the membership. So I'm afraid no breaking news, but what I would say is that the interest in accession by new applicants has spurred the original signatories towards ratification. So last year we welcomed Peru as a new party, finally ratified, and just last Friday Malaysia deposited its instrument of ratification and will become a party at the end of November. So the interest in accession has also been very beneficial for all the original signatories to now ratify the agreement. And that's also a very good thing. Even if these accession processes are continuing in a very considered fashion, it's important to note, and I think this is where the report by Kati and the CSIS report is really important. It underscores how the rules in the CPTPP are actually being built upon in other agreements, including in the region. So we have the CPTPP and who signs up to those, but the rules are now not unique to CPTPP. We're seeing them in USMCA. We've built upon them in the Singapore-Australia Digital Economy Agreement, in our bilateral with the UK, and other agreements in the region. So I think that's a really important point to note, that it is not just a case of applicants signing up to this agreement. It's all the other agreements as well. Thanks, Bill.
Well, related to that, what are the implications of what Kati's talking about here for IPREF? Anybody want to take that one on?
Well, Bill, I might just jump in really quickly and then I'll let others, but certainly CPTPP can provide a very good foundation for IPREF and the further dissemination of CPTPP rules in the region. It also prevents the opportunity to build upon those rules and ensure a greater uptake in the region. But as I noted in one of my previous answers, given the dispersed nature of the membership, we would have to ensure that there is proper time taken for the uptake of those rules and also proper support in the terms of capacity building and economic cooperation.
Jonathan or Sujiro, you want to comment on the IPREF implications, specifically with respect to digital, which is clearly an IPREF priority?
Yeah, I agree with Elizabeth. And we need to, I think, IPEC members should really try to get the very high level. But in order for some of the members to accept that, they really need to maybe improve number of, cases. I mean, capacity building is very important for them to really accept some of the rules. So, but in my view, IPREF focuses or emphasizes capacity building issue. So I think they should go along between, high level rules and capacity building. They should go hand in hand. And I think that's the right approach. Thank you.
Jonathan, do you want to add anything?
Just that I think I would echo Australia, a great foundation for building going forward. We had enhancements in USMCA that I would hope would be carried forward as well, expanding particularly the data localization to the financial services sector. Generally, I thought most of the rules do not require capacity building because, again, it's a negative constraint on a government. Just don't do X, Y, and Z. However, a lot of the new issues that the Biden administration appears more focused on are areas where we don't always have the answers and where capacity building and exchange of experiences, whether it's labor, whether it's how you handle artificial intelligence, probably do require more of the capacity building type approaches.
Okay, we've gone over a little bit because we started late, but let me ask one more question. And unless we have something coming in from the audience, which we haven't yet, then we'll call it a night, a day, afternoon, whatever. One of the things that Kati, I think, recommended in her report was that the e-commerce committee within CPTPP adopt sort of similar implementation review procedures. Would that be a good way to put it, Kati? What are the panelists? What do you think of that? Is this something that should be done internally within the CPTPP structure, or is it better to rely on outside independent think tanks and like us and other parties to do this instead? Thoughts, Elizabeth?
Bill, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a multifaceted approach, and this is where Kati's report is so helpful. It provides an insight into the implementation of the rules. It is also incumbent on the members in the committee to discuss implementation, but also cooperation on the rules. And think tanks, business and consumer groups all play a role in monitoring the implementation, and the information we receive from those different groups can be reflected upon by the committee members. So it is one approach. I wouldn't say it's the only approach, but it is certainly a useful contribution to reflecting on implementation. I think we would be a little bit circumspect at this point on implementing anything such as a formal peer-to-peer review process, such as the WTO trade policy review. That's a long established structure in the WTO, and we're not at that stage at this point, I would say, in the CPTPP. But that said, contribution to the discussion is very important, and shining a light on different members' rules and laws is incredibly important. Thank you.
Well, just when you thought you were all going to get off easy, we do have a question from the audience, which is wonderful news to hear Malaysia just ratified CPTPP. And I'd say that was news to me too. So before I get to the audience question, Elizabeth, who's left? Brunei and one other one then?
Chile.
Okay. Well, that's, almost all the way there. Anyway, the question is, just curious, any plans to set up a secretariat for CPTPP to handle all the administrative functions, including monitoring and implementation of the e-commerce provisions? With the growing numbers of applicants, I imagine the commission setup being transferred from one member to another must be overwhelmed. Any comments on that? Elizabeth, you're the one in the government, so you might, I come back to you first.
Sure. No, there are no plans at this point, but I do note that the rotating nature of the commission, which means every year a different country is responsible for the ongoing maintenance of the agreement and all the meetings, the formal meetings, the ministerial meetings, the senior official meetings. is quite a heavy burden. So while this hasn't been discussed, it's an interesting suggestion. I note if you look at RCEP, for example, there is a proposal to set up a separate secretariat to support the implementation and ongoing work of that agreement. So maybe that's a suggestion that I can take away and discuss with other members. But no, there isn't a proposal at this point for that.
Excellent. Kadi, you want to make a closing comment?
Well, thank you. Just appreciate all the panelists for the very good comments, and this is actually very helpful also for presenting this again to think about how to best frame this and think about all these extensions that we could take on this. I think if we just wanted to take a step back from all the day to day and setting up different structures and so forth, if we think of this as 20 years from now, we'll probably look back to this time post-COVID as a real historic opportunity, particularly for SMEs to engage in trade. And, and these agreements in this part of the world, Southeast Asia, Asia Pacific in particular, as having been the pioneering agreements that have set the ground rules and that have put in place similar rules across the different agreements as well, have kind of created a expanding set of countries that are joining these kinds of good rules. And really what we wanted to do here is to emphasize that, this is a great opportunity, but we also have to take this seriously. We have to take this implementation seriously and not just have these paper agreements that don't have any impact, but really, shape the global landscape, the future landscape of digital trade that opens so much opportunity for small businesses and large ones. And opens these development opportunities that Elizabeth, you're also talking about, that businesses will really benefit from these, and perhaps there's technical assistance also to help SMEs and other businesses to benefit and understand these rules and how they can make use of them. But this is, I think it's a historic time, and we want to make sure that these great rules that have been put in place are actually being applied, so that there's much more convergent kind of national rules in place, and companies are able to navigate the landscape more easily. So really, with that spirit, we took the first step, and hopefully this will be just a conversation starter as we go forward. So thanks very much.
Well, a good note to end on. Thank you for the presentation. A reminder to our audience, go to the website, www.csis.org, and click on the report. You can download it from there. If you can't find it, contact us via email at shoalchair@csis.org, and we'll send you the link. Thank you to the panelists for a very informed comments presentation. Thank you to Kadi for doing all the work. And with that, I'll say good morning, good evening, good night to everybody, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.